Avoiding blurry and noisy video in low light is really easy once you know these 5 tips. Tip number 1 is to film in 6K 30 frames per second. 6K will give you the best video quality possible, and 30 frames per second will give you the smoothest video possible. 30 frames per second is also the minimum recommended frame rate on the Instagram help page, so it's best to stick to 30 frames per second so you can repurpose your content on all social media platforms. Tip number 2 is to set the sharpness to medium. Now usually during the day I would set the sharpness to low, but in low light I find that the camera does a lot of noise reduction, which makes the footage look soft. So to add more detail into the video straight out of the camera, I set the sharpness to medium. Tip number 3 is to use standard color mode. Standard color is like a hybrid between log and vivid color. Standard is not as flat as log, so it's very fast and easy to color grade, and standard is not as saturated and contrasty as vivid, so you have control in editing to tweak the final look of the video. Tip number 4 is the most crucial tip, and it's to move away from auto exposure settings and use manual exposure settings instead. You need to choose the correct ISO and shutter speed yourself to get the best results. To keep your video as sharp as possible from motion blur, you need to set the correct shutter speed, and to keep your video as clean as you can from noise and grain, you need to set your ISO as low as possible. The correct shutter speed depends on the amount of motion in your video. If your camera is still on a monopod, then there is no motion, and your shutter speed should be set to 2 times your frame rate. If you are walking with your camera, then there is moderate motion, and your shutter speed should be set to 4 times your frame rate. If you are doing action sports with your camera, then there is extreme motion, and your shutter speed should be set to 8 times your frame rate. By setting the correct shutter speed depending on the amount of motion in your video, this will guarantee that your footage is never blurry. Depending on where you live and the types of lights in your environment, the shutter speed is also responsible for light flickering in your video. Now, if you see light flickering in your video and your shutter speed is set to a multiple of 60, then you just need to adjust the shutter speed to the next lowest multiple of 50, and this will get rid of all the light flickering in your video. Now that the correct shutter speed is set, I just need to adjust the ISO up and down until the video is not too dark or too bright. And remember, the lower you set the ISO, the more cleaner your video will look. And that's how you set the shutter speed and ISO manually in low light. If you want to learn more about manual exposure and see more examples about how to set the correct exposure, then check out my course, How to Avoid Noise, Blur and Light Flicker in the Best 360 Academy. And once you're in the Best 360 Academy, you can check out all the other courses that come with it. You will also learn how to create these funky time shifts using speed ramping in Premiere Pro. Tip number 5 is to set a manual white balance. So to do this, cycle through the white balance settings and pick the one that looks most natural to you. In this indoor theme park, I picked the white balance of 5500 Kelvin throughout all the shots. So use 5500 Kelvin as a starting point, then move the settings left and right until the video is not too warm or too cool. That's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. Hit the like button if you learned something new. Subscribe for more 360 tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.